Hello and welcome to SDHistCon Second Front 2024. I'm Andrew Buckles from the SDHist team. I'm here with Brian Train, who a very prominent designer, and we really appreciate his contributions to this convention, including a great earlier interview with Harold Buchanan and Rex Brynan, which is well worth your time if you want to check out later. That's on the SDHist YouTube channel. Brian, this one is for here, one sec, kill that feedback. So Brian, as per your Board Game Geek bio, you've been playing war games since 1979. What first got you interested in them, and what were some of your first played games?
Thanks, Andrew. It's great to be here, and thank you for the interview. The first time I saw a war game, like a hex-based war game, was in 1976 or so. And I was at my then best friend's house, and his older brother had a copy of World War III by SPI. So it was a hex map of the whole world, and it had these mushroom cloud counters strewn all over it. And I thought, oh, this looks neat. That was 1976. And it wasn't until a couple of years later, when I moved out to British Columbia, where I live now, that my favorite uncle sent me a copy of Tactics 2, the old Tactics 2 by Avalon Hill for Christmas. And I don't know, I don't think my parents ever forgave him for doing that. But it was great, you know, because I was starting in on that. And so I took to it right away. And some of my first games were Tactics 2, of course. I also picked up on some SPI games, like folio games like Bundeswehr, S&T games like Paratroop or Raid. And at the time, there was a company called Metagaming that was doing these very cheap little micro games that were mostly on science fiction and fantasy themes. I didn't have a lot of money, and there was only one store in town that stocked any games. So those were the ones that I picked up. I picked up on, and that was 1979. And within a couple years, I had done my first amateur game design. It was a crude game that I did in 1981-82 on the Busan perimeter phase of the Korean War. There's just one copy, and there it is. Where did Andrew go? Okay, maybe I'll just keep talking. So that.
Apologies for the technical issue there. We're back, but
it's okay. I just kept talking.
Fantastic. So sorry. Did you so you got into designing? You were talking about, and how did that sort of take off from there?
Yeah, well, as I said, there was 81-82. I did that first crude game, just one copy, which I think I still have around, typewritten rules and all that. But it wasn't until 10 years later, I was in Japan teaching English. And I was in Japan, I was on the other side of the Pacific, and I had no games with me. Like I had one or two little micro games like I'd taken with me. But there were no new games, and I couldn't read Japanese, you know, to make sense of any games or anything like that. And, you know, I learned Go, which is a wonderful game, but I wanted to play a war game. So I started to design my own. And the first couple of games that I designed, the first one was called Power Play. It was about a coup d'etat in an imaginary country, a very small, very fast game that, among other things, uses a deck of ordinary playing cards. And that's a mechanic I picked up on. There's probably 9 or 10 games in my collection that I've designed that use 1 or 2 decks of ordinary playing cards to drive the action. It's a great little mechanic generator. And the second game I designed was called Civil Power. It's a tactical game on riots, mobs, you know, civil disorder, all that kind of thing, which was a topic I'd always been interested in because I'd been in the Canadian Army. And there's aid of the civil power, which is one of the functions, you know, which is when the military is turned out to help law enforcement or civil government. And also, when I was in Japan, I was ordering books from a used bookstore in Tokyo for English language books. And one of the books that I got was The Great Shark Hunt, which is a collection of articles by Hunter S. Thompson. You know, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas and stuff like that. And in this collection, there was a piece called The Police Chief. And he was in it, he was writing as somebody called Raoul Duke, Master of Weapons. And so he's writing in the persona of this maniac who's just talking about, you know, we don't have the right weapons to kill the hippies. You know, we need flamethrowers to control, you know, to use these riots and things like that. So I thought that I would probably I don't usually play or design on the tactical level, but I wanted to do a tactical level game on this kind of mobs, riots, you know, that kind of thing. And that was actually another early theme that I've maintained through my design career is call it game-based journalism. Where you can use a game to kind of explore, set up a situation in a contemporary situation, kind of explore it. Because as I was designing the game, I would be reading articles in the newspaper and I would design a scenario to fit it. So for example, some of the scenarios in earlier editions of the game were like student riots in Seoul. And of course, while I was there, I was in Japan from 90 to 92, you had the Los Angeles riots, the Rodney King riots. And I designed games about sort of historical campaigns as well. Chicago, 1968, Paris, 1968. There was an incident in Pretoria, I think, or Johannesburg. Anyway, the scenario is a bunch of Afrikaner neo-Nazis are trying to break into a hotel to disrupt a speech by F.W. de Klerk. And that was something I happened to see a newspaper story about it. And I thought, and I sat down and designed a scenario for it in the game. So, you know, that was an early thing. And since then, I've designed a number of other games that were done either during the historical conflict or event or shortly afterwards that allowed people to kind of explore the problem or look at my interpretation of the problem and explore it in game form.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a couple of fascinating things there. First, I love that you mentioned Hunter S. Thompson. He's one of my favorite writers, and I think it's really cool how you look at games as having the ability to be journalism or journalistic, have journalistic aspects. I think that's really fascinating. My day job's journalism, so that's something I'm definitely interested in. Your first published game, as per BGG, is Land of the Free on Depression-era U.S. politics, and so that ties into some of what you were talking about civil power and protests and that. Can you talk about Land of the Free and why you decided to make a game on Depression-era U.S. politics?
Yeah, thank you. That was one of the first couple of games that I had published, you know, other than by myself. And that was through a group called the Microgame Design Group, which I created with Carrie Anderson of Alberta. Originally, it was called the Microgame Co-op. And this was a game publishing group that was nonprofit by design, not by outcome. You know, it's like the old joke, how do you make a small fortune and publish it? You can start with a large one. But the idea with that was to give physical form and graphic form to amateur game designers' ideas, and then get them out to people for the cost of what it would cost to produce and mail them. And Land of the Free was one of the first that came out through there. Also, Arriba España, which is a game I did on the Spanish Civil War, and Shining Path, which was a game on the Sendero Luminoso guerrilla movement, which was burbling away in Peru at the time. Now, the idea for Land of the Free came from an old copy of Strategy and Tactics magazine. People who remember SPI and Strategy and Tactics magazine remember that in the back, there was a feedback section, and they would run in every issue. They would run anywhere between 5 and 10 different proposals for games, and there was a feedback card that you would come in, send in saying, "Oh, I love this idea," or "I hate this idea. Don't ever do it." And it was really neat to go back and look through old designs from old issues of S&T from these early years, and look at these ideas, these proposals for games that were never published, And one of them was for Land of the Free. And there was just this little one-paragraph explanation, a proposal about the game. I have no idea who came up with the original idea for it, because these things were unsigned. It was probably James Dunnigan, because he liked these kind of unusual topics. But basically the idea was, in the Depression in the United States, as with many other countries, it was a time of great political and social ferment. So you had all these populist, you had communist parties, you had fascist movements, you had populists of different kinds. And even though they were never huge mass movements the way they had in like France or, of course, Germany or Italy, these movements were still very evocative of the polarization of how people thought they should get out of the fix that they're in. And there were some crazy ideas too, like technocracy and stuff like that. Things that were uniquely American, I gotta say. And so I thought that it would be interesting to do a game on these sort of extremist political movements that existed kind of beyond the two-party mechanism. They were kind of on the fringe of American political practices as they were then. But there was always the potential for violence. There's always the potential for, for mass disorder that these movements could exploit. And even though they were kind of like below the radar, they could still exert influence on the major parties. And so this game is for 3 players. So you've got a communist and a fascist and a populist player. And they all have slightly different mixes of forces. They have slightly different agendas. It's not as asymmetric a game as other games I would design, but it was interesting that way. And in it, you try to organize on the state level and try to infiltrate and take over state governments. Like what Huey Long did in Louisiana, of course. I don't know how Huey Long is regarded in the state that you're living in now, but to some people he's still a folk hero, And then, of course, and so then we have historical leaders, that I have portrayed in the game, like Al Capone and Father Coughlin, things like that. So just interesting little bits of Depression era history, and they rove around on the map, organizing, raising mobs, attacking each other with smear campaigns. And, there's this current of migrant laborers, like Okies, coming one way or the other, and, that are forced out and into other states by economic conditions. And of course, they have a potential for disorder as well. So it's a game on a potentially violent situation, with a political outcome, and it doesn't lead to a civil war or anything like that, but it's just an examination of these kinds of extreme political movements. And this was, again, designed in 1995, so it has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on now. No, nothing at all.
For sure. No, I mean, it is interesting how some historical things come back around. And that does sound fascinating. I'm particularly interested in the Huey Long connection because, that's still very much a topic of debate down here in Louisiana.
Yeah.
So moving from politics to out and out insurgencies and military insurgencies and counterinsurgency efforts, you've done a lot on that front. Why does that topic interest you?
Well, it's not really moving off of politics at all, because one thing that you'll find in most of my games is a really heavy larding of political context and political content and things. Even I designed somewhere around 70 to 75 different games that I put out there. At least half of them, 40 or so, deal with irregular warfare, guerrilla warfare, low intensity combat, insurgency, whatever you want to call it. And pretty much all of them are pitched after 1945 or some kind of generic but modern setting. And this is because irregular warfare is what has actually been happening over the last 60 years. There have been spates of conventional combat between one or two countries, like the Iran-Iraq War, for example, that went on for a while, the Falklands, which was over in 6 months, and then, of course, the present, Ukraine war that's going on. And those are somewhat evenly matched conventional conflicts, but they still have their political dimensions, of course, and political reasonings. But most conflict that's happened, has been irregular warfare. So it's what's actually going on, and I think most of the conflict in human history has been irregular rather than regular, but most of the history of that has been unwritten, because again, it's written by the victors. But certainly, in modern conflict, it's the default mode. And I've always had this interest in contemporary conflicts, exploring contemporary conflicts and looking at them that way. Through game design, it's a way of me, doing research and exploring and trying to make sense of the world and contemporary events and trying to get them centered and organized in my head, and a way of organizing them, an understanding of them, and to explore them in game form, and then to try and share that with other people. And so that's why the interest in irregular warfare and contemporary warfare. But again, this is a minority interest. As far as hobby wargamers are concerned, civilian wargamers, they're simply not that interested. I came to the conclusion long ago that every wargamer has a deep interest in history generally, and an encyclopedic knowledge of one or more periods of history, Napoleonics or the American Civil War or whatever. But by and large, statistically, they don't seem to be any more interested in the conflicts that are going on nowadays than people who don't play war games. That doesn't mean that they're ignorant. It just means that, they're not interested in learning about this kind of thing or exploring this kind of thing in game form. Fair enough. As I said, I'm designing mostly for me and my own understanding first, and then, sharing that with people. And of course, it's a lot of it is through just like free print and play, that I've made available over the years, or the things like the micro game design group, where we made stuff available for very cheap. But it was just, kind of getting the idea out there, which is, of course, that's a kind of an egotistical exercise when you think about it, like, how dare I do all that research and then present it as if I'm some kind of an authority on it, because I'm not. I'm not a professional historian. I'm not a military analyst or anything like that. But it's kind of how I make sense of things.
For sure. And the next, so I mean, I think you're right on the large level there, that there's maybe less interest in modern things. There's maybe less interest in insurgencies. But one real exception there seems to be to that is GMT's Coin series. And of course, you've done 2 published ones there. You've got a 3rd one in the process. What convinced you at the start with A Distant Plain that series was the right fit to work in for a game on Afghanistan?
Well, there's a story behind that, and maybe some of the people who will be listening to this later have already heard it. But it's that my work before the coin system partially influenced the creation of the coin system. So beginning in 1995, or 94, 95, one of the first games that I designed was a game on the Tupamaros, which was an urban guerrilla movement in Uruguay in the 60s. And that game was the predecessor of another game that I've already mentioned, the one on the Shining Path, the Sendero Luminoso guerrillas in Peru. And that followed on other games I did on the Greek Civil War, the war in Algeria, that kind of thing. And it used a common system that I called, I didn't call it, somebody else invented the name, called the 4-box system. And you had your counters. It was an area movement map, and you had these counters that were placed in 4 different boxes inside each area that indicated what they were doing or what they could do and how they could be affected. And as I said, I designed a game on the Algerian War about 2000. And about 7 years later, I was contacted by somebody in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, as it was then called, who said that he had been using my game on Algeria as the basis for his model of the Iraqi insurgency, which was then bubbling away. And would I be interested in attending this event of the Military Operations Research Society, which is a group of civilian and military analysts? They were having this workshop on irregular warfare. This is 2007, and to see, what he had done with my models. So I said, sure, I'll go. And it turned out that there were actually a couple of people who were using my work as the basis for their games, which I found really interesting. And while I was there, I met somebody who was working. He's retired now, so I guess I I can say he's was an analyst with the CIA, and he was teaching at the Sherman Kent School for Analysis, which is where the CIA trains its military and political analysts. And so we met, and we were talking about using my Algeria game as something to be used in his classroom. And we worked out this degridded version that could be played fairly quickly in a classroom for this class he was holding on revolutionary warfare. And the Algerian War was one of his case studies. Now, at that time, Volko was also teaching at the Sherman Kent School. And Volko happened to see Charles using this game in his class. And he thought, oh, this is interesting. So he got his own copy of Algeria. And I didn't realize this at the time. But, you know, he used some of what was in my game on Algeria and his own experience in working out on Labyrinth and Washington's War, of course, his games that he had already designed. And that's how he created the coin system. Which came out in Andean Abyss. And that was the first game in the coin system. That came out about 2010, 2011. I play tested Andean Abyss at the Consum World Expo in Tempe in 2010 without realizing the influence. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. This guy's really onto something good. This is cool, you know, without seeing my own influence. And it wasn't until the game was formally published and Volko name checks me in the designer's notes for Andean Abyss in the playbook, saying, you know, yeah, Brian's work really contributed to the concepts and the design of this, which is fantastic because Volko, as everybody knows, is an incredibly generous and helpful person who really acknowledges his intellectual debts when he has one. When he has them. And of course, you know, people owe him a lot of intellectual debt as well. But anyway, that was the start of it. That was around 2011. So 2011, 2012, I finally met Volko at a conference on professional wargaming called Connections. And we got along, you know, very well. And we agreed right away, look, we should collaborate on a game. Volko says, Brian, what do you think we should do? And Brian says, well, I think we should do Afghanistan. Let's go for the big one. And so we started work in 2012, 2013. The game came together really quickly, and it came out really quickly. GMT made an effort to really push it down the slipways fast. And the game was out in 2013, even before the projected end of the game, which was 2014, which was when NATO ended its combat mission in Afghanistan. So that was, again, an elaborate exercise, again, in what we can call game-based journalism, because we put this thing out while the conflict was still going on. And, you know, you know, some people thought that was, you know, maybe not a good idea, but it seems to me that there were more people who thought it was a good idea than thought it was a bad idea. And it was, of course, was received very well. It's still a very popular game. It did not at the time claim to be a predictive game or a predictive exercise, and people did not take it like that. Most people did not take it like that. And so, you know, it's been a really enduring success. And of course, working with Volko is just a pleasure. The man is incredibly competent and thoughtful and creative and very pleasant to deal with as a human being. So, you know, that was great. That was one of the better experiences I've had in collaborating with people.
For sure. No, that's very cool. And then your next coin is interesting to me, of Colonial Twilight. It's one of my favorite games. And obviously you talked about how you've been doing games on Algeria before and how that sort of formed this. But what was it like taking the coin series that had been so multiplayer down to 2 players? Yeah.
Well, like I said, the Algeria game that I designed in 2000 was, as far as I could tell, the first war game designed in any language on the Algerian War. And Colonial Twilight is the 3rd game ever published on the Algerian War. In between, there was a second one called Ici c'est la France that was designed by a guy called Kim Kanger about 2010. So it was 2014 or 2015 when GMT asked me, would you like to do a game on the Algerian War using the coin system? And I said, sure. And I went away and I thought about it. And I thought about it, you know, kind of going full circle on this. And I really did think seriously about ways to make it a 4-player game, because up until that time, all the games were 4 players. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought it's really not going to work this way, because there were many, like like there are very few conflicts that are strictly, one side versus another. There's always factions. There's always people caught in the middle, all this kind of thing. And I thought about it, and and went through, I went over all my research that I had done, a few years before, and then I, continued to do more reading and more research. And yes, there were other parties concerned, like the Pieds Noirs, the French, inhabitants of Algeria, as well as the Muslim inhabitants of Algeria, and different tribes and, political movements and factions within the insurgency itself, this kind of thing. And I thought, nobody in the conflict is really active and strong enough continuously through the length of the conflict for me to make this a credible 4-player account. And so what I did was I ended up going, cracking the 4-body problem down to a 2-body problem. But there are lots of events and mechanisms within that 2-body mechanism, a general framework for the game, that I think reflect things like factions within the FLN, the activities of the Pieds Noirs. There's the whole mechanism towards the end of the game where the OAS comes out, which really can send the game into a blood spiral, which what happened, historically. But it's that sort of thing that you can implement in the game mechanics and give, fair shrift to, that particular dimension of the conflict without necessarily adding an entire new faction or player. I mean, it's the same thing as a few people asked us, why isn't there a separate Pakistani player in A Distant Plain? And, why isn't it a 5-player instead of 4? Well, I mean, you kind of have to stop at 4. And because the point, for example, Pakistan, like, the Pakistani sanctuary was really important, for the Taliban. But the Pakistani government didn't take enough of a role continuously. Like, there wouldn't be very much for a Pakistani player to do, in the game. And it was kind of the same thing there. And so from going from the 4-player to the 2-player, it was, it just required visualizing the sequence of play in a slightly different way. And instead of having 2 of the 4 factions that are eligible to do something in each card, both factions are eligible. It's just a question of who goes first and who goes second. And whoever goes first, their choice, affects, what the second player can do. And it just was visualizing it a different way. And if you played Colonial Twilight, then you see that sort of, people call it the horseshoe or the home plate or the pentagon or whatever. That's just a different way of showing the relations graphically. And it is very, very close to how the action is represented in the 4-player games. But instead of it looking like a flow chart, instead it's just a different graphic. And, the choices are determined by physical adjacencies as opposed to arrows on the flow chart. And that representation will also work for the 4-player games if you find that compelling. Later we'll be talking about China's War, which is the next coin system game that I've been working on. And an earlier edition, we did have that sort of home plate looking thing, with a couple boxes there for eligibility for the 4 factions. But the play testers and the developers said, well, this isn't as intuitive as I thought it was, so we're going back to the flow chart look of things. But it's perfectly acceptable way of representing it.
For sure. Yeah, last coin series one question there on China's War. What convinced you that conflict in 1937 to 41 in particular was right for a coin game?
Yeah, well, China, actually, I'm working on 2 coin system games right now, or they're mostly complete. One is China's War, and I started working on China's War in 2015, about the same time that I started work on Colonial Twilight. And I got it to about the 2/3, 3/4 done phase. And I had to kind of shelve it in order to spend the time on Colonial Twilight and get it finished off properly. But I think everybody agrees that was time well spent, because I'm really pleased with how Colonial Twilight came out. But it was a few years after that I picked up on China's war and started developing it again. And in between, we had COVID, and I was working on other projects and that kind of thing. And it's getting pretty close to being finished. This afternoon, GMT will have their their designer and developer update, and I'll just be talking quickly about that. So that's close to being close. The mystery fourth game is called O Canada. And this is a game that I came up with during lockdown. And this is a game which is a non-violent variation on the GMT coin system on modern Canadian politics from the 1950s to the near future. It's got 4 different scenarios, each of which is like a 25-year stretch in Canadian politics. And it's a revisioning of the conflict. In that, here we have China's war, which is like one of the largest theaters of war in World War II. Millions of people killed, starved, moved around, disease, death everywhere, and global power shifts, came out of what was going on here in the 1930s. And the same system, I'm using a variation of the same system for about the least violent, most polite kind of civil engagement you can think of, Canadian politics. But the conflict there is fought out on 2 levels. There's the sort of level of provincial politics and parties and mechanics and that kind of thing. And then there's a level of non-material, fighting over, control of the narrative on certain issues, the economy, taxation, hockey, that kind of thing. And there, in a sense, it is a reboot of a 4-player game that SPI put out in 1976 called Canadian Civil War. They even put a little, not the arrows, but quotation marks. And this was something that came out in 1976 because of the Parti Québécois and Quebec separatism and all that kind of thing. But it was for 4 players. It was a power politics game, but it's all symmetrical. This one is an asymmetrical game, but you've got the 4 factions are 4 tendencies in Canadian politics. So there's the Federalists, who believe in a strong central government but weaker provinces, 2 flavors of provincial autonomists, and then separatists, who don't believe in actually splitting the country apart politically, but, forming the country into more like a federation like the European Union, that kind of thing. So the political parties and alignments don't matter so much, but as so much as their tendencies. So this way you can take a look at the whole look of the country. I've always thought that the GMT coin system didn't have to be stuck in modern insurgencies. The first few games are, Afghanistan, Cuba, Colombia, that kind of thing. But, we have examples of the coin system being used all the way from Arthurian Britain, and now Red Dust Rebellion is coming out, same system, but it's colonization of Mars. So it's not something that's really constrained by time or type of conflict. And so I always thought it was a good kind of game system that could be used to model power politics, where nobody actually gets hurt, but political struggle still goes on. And that's, O Canada is my, thing like that. So as I said, it is a coin system game. It's 4 players. It's asymmetrical, uses a variation. Anybody who's played a coin system game will find it very familiar. It has a deck of event cards full of jokes that are comprehensible only to Canadians. Therefore, it's unsaleable, at least by GMT, and there aren't any Canadian wargame publishers as such. So this sort of thing I'll probably be putting out myself, later on. Once the dust settles with China's war, I'll probably finish up with graphics and making it available to people for for cheap. But anyway, back to China's war. So with China's war, there were different phases because, there are people who will tell you, that World War II really began in 1931 with the Manchuria incident. And this is where Japan, of course, is, expanding into Manchuria aggressively, creates puppet state of Manchukuo. And then they make other, they lean on China in other ways. And of course, China was exploited by other countries at the time with the unequal treaties and so forth. And, by 1930, China was already in the throes of a civil war. The warlord period, they passed through that. The nationalists were dominant. But then you have the Chinese Communist Party, and so all of that goes on. Now, again, in 1931, as far as China is concerned, you can say, why did you start the game in 1937? You could start the game in 1931. You could start it in 1927, when the nationalists, dominated, became the preeminent warlord. You could start it in 1911, with Sun Yat-sen and the revolt then. You could go back to 1900 and the Boxer Rebellion. I mean, it's just a question. It's China. How far back do you go? Hundreds, thousands of years. There are games, that pick up on that and do take that long, focus on Chinese political and social history. But between 1937 and 1941, that was a period of time when it was when a four-player, a four-faction game, four-tendency game made kind of sense to me, because this was Japan's overt and large invasion of China itself, trying to conquer as much of the country as possible and subjugate it. You had the nationalist faction, which is the government of China, Republic of China. You have the Communist Party, which, the elements of which had survived the Long March and were established in Shanxi. And then you had the warlords. And of course, that is a hideous abstraction, because there were dozens, if not hundreds, of regional little warlords, and so that it's a really heinous abstraction to take all of these, but generally these are regional forces that are nominally under the control of the Republic of China government, but they definitely have their own agenda. So again, that drives the four-player structure of the game, and of course, like the other, the rest of the coin system, they all have asymmetries in means and methods, motives. And from 1937 to 41, the first couple of years, 1937 to 1939 or so, that's when you see the bulk of the most intense armed conflict. After 1941, Japan was pretty well convinced. Actually, there were Japanese generals who were convinced by 1939 that, hey, this is a quagmire. We should just shut this place down or get out. But by 1941, definitely the Japanese had decided for the Strike South faction. And that kind of drove, the rest of the war. So from 1941 or 1942 to 1944, very little happened in China that affected, the course of the Pacific War. There were, of course, battles for Changsha and other cities, but it wasn't until 1944 that the Japanese did this offensive, and then 1945 there was, the collapse in China. So 37 to 41, that's a time when you have four players, four factions, I think, that have enough to do, and heavy-duty interaction with each other. And that, I think, would probably, I think that's when it covers. People have already asked me, okay, are you going to do an expansion kit for the Civil War afterwards? And I would say no. I have no intention of doing that, because you'd need to create some different mechanisms. You'd need to go to a completely different structure, and you'd need a completely different event deck. By that time, there was nothing left it's just a very straight head-to-head armed conflict with no nuance in it. It was, it was going to go red or it was going to go blue. And I already have designed a game about that. Back in 1999, 2000, I designed Battle for China, a game which has been published by several companies since then, which is an area movement and counter game, more like your standard war game, but with a lot of political content in it that takes on the 37 to 41 phase. But I also designed at the same time an expansion kit that allows you to play out through the rest of the war and then on into the Civil War. So if that's what floats your boat, I did that 25 years ago.
For sure. Well, both China's War and O Canada sound fascinating to me. Moving on to well, I'm a proud Canadian. I would love to play a game on Canadian politics and the coin system, and I'm a big fan of the coin system. But moving on to another series you've got, though, you've got the District Commander with Hollandspiel, and maybe with that, why was a series the right approach for you?
Well, I started playing games in 1979, so I got into it just in the last couple of years of SPI and the games that they turned out. One of the best ideas that SPI had, and one of their best sellers, was the quad game, which was the idea of a set of core rules with 4 particular games on 4 particular battles, that were in one box. And that was my intention to create. And I've done it in 2 directions. One was Brief Border Wars, which is 4 games using a set of standard rules and exclusive rules, and you've got 4 of them in one box. And then there's the District Commander system, which uses a set of core rules plus exclusive rules for each game. But instead of 4 games in one box, you've got 4 games in 4 boxes. I did go into this idea with Hollandspiel when I was talking to Emma Bell Russell about getting the games published. And she thought at the time that it would probably make more commercial sense to release them in order, as have them come out, time and again. Because the 4 games, it's just fine to produce them, one in a box, because they share standard rules and 1 sheet of standard counters. But there's exclusive rules. Every game has its own different flavors, its own different complications, and its own, sheet of counters as well. So component-wise, there's some sharing, but it makes sense to do it, kind of spread out. Also, that saved them the production problems of having a map artist work on 4 maps at the same time and 4 sets of counters, which was very expensive. They did do that with one of my titles, where Ukrainian Crisis and The Little War came out as 2 games in one box. And they found that very expensive, in terms of, paying the map artists, so that kind of thing. So I think they were not so keen on that particular idea, and it's just fine. I think both approaches are just great. Brief Border Wars apparently has sold well. Volume 2 of Border Wars is coming out probably in a couple of months. But with District Commander, again, it's the same approach as a quad. It's just they've been, they've just appeared over the last couple of years. I think it's. I really like the idea because there are certain families of systems. Like, as I said, I've done about 70 or 75 games. Probably half of what I've done are games that belong to one system or another. I've got maybe 5 or 6 families of design. I mentioned the 4-box system for insurgency games. Then there's the District Commander system, which is another look at diceless games in operational level counterinsurgency. There's like a Between the Wars system, which is Finnish Civil War, Freikorps, that kind of thing. But the other half of what I've done, another 30 or 35 games, these are games that use systems that I never used before, or never used again. And elements of which can affect the development of other systems, but sometimes they don't. But I kind of like the idea, and other people like the idea too, of learning a standard set of rules, and then it's basically like this, because there are basic things that you have to do in every game. You have to move your guys around, you have to keep them fed, you have to give them things to do, combat, that kind of thing. But everything else is, not necessarily Chrome, but it's things that are reflective of the particular nature of the conflict. And so with those 4 games in the District Commander system, we have that kind of reflection. We've got some of the games have non-state militias and a role for organized crime as sort of semi-automatic opponents. But other games don't have that. In Bin Din, which is the Vietnam District Commander title, and the Algeria title, Zone Nord-Orange, you have the insurgent has the task of running supply convoys across the map, and the counterinsurgent has the idea of trying to intercept that. And of course, that's not present in 2 of the other games as well. In the Vietnam game, for example, there's a role for Agent Orange. I think this is the only game so far that's reflected the use of deliberate use of Agent Orange or defoliants in a game. But that's, or population resettlement, those kinds of things. So those are all particular to that particular conflict, but it's something that you can work into that basic set of rules with some, different mechanics without overloading things with processor or Chrome or even necessary die rolls.
For sure. Well, this has been fantastic, Brian. One last one for you. You mentioned Brief Border Wars and how you have the second one of that coming out. What really interests you about gaming those short and maybe lesser known conflicts?
Well, they sure are lesser known. The first game I've done there's 2 volumes and 4 in a box, but there were actually 9 games using that system. The first one was the Little War, which was called the Little War. It was a 1-week border war between Hungary and Slovakia in 1939. As Czechoslovakia was falling apart and being gobbled up by Nazi Germany, Hungary took the opportunity to seize, some different areas of Slovakia for about a week before the Germans told them to quit it. So I picked like 9 examples here of these kinds of wars that were politically and significant and historically relevant, but they were not necessarily militarily decisive. Sometimes they were. Like, for example, there's in the first volume, there's a game about the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, and they invaded and they, established the partition of Cyprus, which extends to this day. But then there are other games in that box that were, fairly short, but intense, but kind of, at the end, the military status quo was the same as it was, so like there's the soccer war in that same box, 100 hours long. It was the 100-hour war between El Salvador and Honduras. Which realigned things politically between the 2 countries, but militarily it was quite indecisive. At the other end of the spectrum, another game in the box is the China-Vietnam War, which went on for about 6 or 8 weeks and involved huge numbers of people and a lot of destruction of property and movement of people. But in the end, it didn't really change much between China and Vietnam. But these are all good subjects for snappy, short games that are run by an altered deck of cards, like the Little War used a deck of playing cards. The big difference with these Brief Border Wars that are being released by Compass Games is that you have a deck of cards that drive the action, but they're drawn according to a bell curve instead of the linear values of a deck of ordinary playing cards. But it gives a game that is 6 or 7 turns long. So you can play, once you're familiar with the system, you can play it out in like an hour or so. So it's a really good candidate for this kind of short, snappy thing. And of course, each conflict has its own craziness built within it, special units, special this and that. And there's always all kinds of options and variations that you can give to handicap or give an advantage to one side or the other. And as I said, people like it. Volume 1 sold well. Volume 2 was a partial, casualty of COVID as well, but it's coming out finally after a couple of months from now, I'm told by Compass Games. And of course, as soon as I turned in Volume 2, John Krantz was after me saying, well, what about Volume 3? So,
right.
So I have the idea. I have the conflicts for Volume 3 picked out in my mind. Time and interest permitting, there may yet be a Volume 3.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time here, Brian. We really appreciate it and love playing your games and look forward to all these other things you have coming out.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Let's do this again.
All right. Absolutely.
Okay. Have a good day.
You as well.